The final piece of the puzzle when it comes to rendering is going to be the technique that the clay is applied with. This can of course be done in a million ways, I'm sure, but here is the one that I use to apply clay and ensure that the modeling goes by smoothly and that I get a good end result as well. We've dubbed it the dragon roll after the piece of sushi, which is a nice piece of sushi, and after what actually happens when you apply clay in this way, what you do with your tool essentially, the motion of the tool. You drag the wood tool and at the same time you roll the wood tool over a little bit. The key to the rolling is that it sort of forces the drag to take place over a shorter space, and a big issue with finished textures, in my opinion, is when we see these long tool streaks traveling across the surface. It never looks very good, I think, though of course finished textures and what looks good and what doesn't look good is certainly up for debate. Shorter and slightly more random feeling movements or texture in the final surface are more likely to represent skin a little bit better, and I think appears more pleasing from an aesthetic point of view as well. There's a couple of other tricks that I find really useful. One is working across the forms, as opposed to working with the forms. So when we apply clay to our sculpture in the beginning, when we're building it up, we're applying clay with the form to better describe the form in a rough state. Once we model the surface, it's much better to work across the form in order to subtly blend them together and retain shape, plane, and volume, and transition. Across the form is the trick that many students will miss out on. Now, across the form, combined with shorter movements of the tool, is going to help a lot in terms of modeling, especially if you're doing so with a wood tool like I am here. A final little trick that you can add to your arsenal is to work not only across the form, but at a perpendicular angle to the shape of the form itself. This way, we're truly getting the most out of this technique. It's essentially the same as working across the form, but with another little wrinkle added to it that helps tremendously. Slightly change up the angles you model at and make sure that there is a sense of randomness to the whole ordeal. I don't think you want it to appear too intentional once finished, as this sort of betrays the natural and organic surface which we're trying to emulate here. As we model, we either expose problems we couldn't see, or sometimes we create problems by accident. We have to be aware of this and pay close attention to this phenomenon. A typical mistake, which is very tough to catch, is asymmetries in the depths at which supposedly symmetrical features sit at. By observing from above or below, we'll be able to tell exactly at what depth the symmetrical feature sits on either side of the center line. Typical ones that cause people problems are more obvious ones like the eye sockets, the corners of the mouth, and the back of the nostrils. These are all fairly easy to see once we observe from above or below, as they're more like points as opposed to broader forms. An issue I ran into here, which can be harder to catch, I think, is depth issues with broad turning forms, which are a little bit more ambiguous, like for example the form of the cheekbones. You have to check these forms every now and then and be diligent. Don't work without having a conscious idea of what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what could go wrong as well in doing so. Applying clay without thinking is certainly going to cause more harm than good. There's no question about that. So be careful and attentive with the clay that's being applied to your work. Always apply clay as an answer to a question asked from a distance. And make sure to double check symmetry in depth from above and below frequently, so any potential issues don't get too far out of hand. Sometimes details get a little too subdued due to all the softening that we're doing with the loop tool and the rakes here. So to fix that, we sometimes need to go back and clean up detailed areas and sharpen them up a bit again. This doesn't have to be too difficult and can often be left until the very end of a project. The details that I'm talking about are things that will end up needing to be rather sharp, like creases, for example. Creases have a tendency to get softer and messier with clay inside of them as we spray and wrap the work and spray and wrap the work back and forth. And especially if we don't tend to them. But tending to them every time you work can also get a bit annoying and sort of feel like a waste of time. They're also often prone to having cracking in the bottom of them, which usually is going to be hard to see and rarely causes any big problems in terms of the work staying on the armature. But the cracking happens because it's tough to get a solid base of clay at the bottom of the crease, and so we have a hollow inside the clay, inside our clay sculpture, which water gets trapped inside of when we spray and then dissolves the clay a little bit, causing it to sort of come apart and crack. Since this tends to be a recurring issue, I'll usually try to clean up the creases towards the very end of a project only, and not every day that I'm working on it. But such a time is now, as we're nearing the end here. There's no easy solution to creases. I wish there was, because it's very time-consuming and difficult work. The best tip I think I can give is to remember that creases need to turn down. Each side of the crease must meet each other vertically. Otherwise, it will look like we're not dealing with soft skin, but soft skin against a hard material like a chair, or hard material against hard material in the worst case scenario. Start to turn from the high point of the form down into the bottom of the crease, as far away from the bottom of the crease as you can get away with, and you're more likely to achieve a soft result doing so. This is because a form that has a longer turning radius is going to be much more prone to being soft. Short form turns, quick turning form, are by default usually sharp, and long form turns are by default soft. Now, at this point, we've already done all of that work, and now we're mostly working inside the creases. When working inside the creases, make sure that you use a sharp tool. I'm using a very small loop tool with a very thin wire loop here. This is going to keep the crease from getting this broad plane at the bottom of it. If your tool is too wide, it will create a little plane inside the crease that can, depending on the angle of the crease, catch light, making it appear like the crease has a light shining from the inside of it, like your sculpture is lit from the inside, and this really is not very natural looking. Try to keep this from happening by making sure that the plane your tool is making inside the crease is as narrow as you can possibly make it. I mean, ideally non-existent, but that can be sort of impossible to pull off. But making sure that it's as minimal as you can make it keeps the crease looking sharp like the crease should look. And not like it's being slightly opened up.